Hello everyone, my name is Fisher Stines, and today I'd like to talk with you about my real ecology project of the ecology of the Bigleaf Magnolia at Redlair Preserve in Gaston County, North Carolina. So for this project, I collected some of the data in 2019 as part of a larger project to establish a baseline ecological study of the Bigleaf Magnolia at this preserve. So this was a partnership between my current employer, the North Carolina Plant Conservation Program, and my former employer, the Catawba Lands Conservancy. So both of these are landowners of this preserve and manage the bigleaf magnolia. So they were looking for some information that might help them with the management of the species. Also using this as my bachelor's thesis in this research project at NC State, and now it's coming in quite handy for this real ecology project. So I'm using this data for a few different reasons, but it's really because the bigleaf magnolia is such a special species to me that has some really interesting ecology, and it's from my hometown of Gastonia, North Carolina. So of that original larger study, the main goal was to establish some sort of a long-term monitoring infrastructure. If you happen to dive into the literature of the bigleaf magnolia, you'll find rather quickly that almost all of the studies begin with the line, "Very little is known about the species." So with that in mind, just establishing this long-term monitoring infrastructure will be extremely helpful in the next 5 to 10 years as we can begin to better understand the population dynamics and how the bigleaf magnolia is performing at this site, which is quite frankly sort of an northeastern disjunct population from what I would consider to be the core of the distribution west of the Appalachian Mountains. So as I touched on already, also investigating the dynamics of the bigleaf magnolia population, as well as investigating what role it plays in the communities at Redlair. And that's all of great interest in this larger project. And in this project, I did a stratified random sample collecting information on 70 100 square meter plots. You can see here that each of these orange dots represents the candidate site, and each of these white dots represents the sites that were actually taken. And for this project, we're going to zoom in right down here in the center to the Old Lake Creek watershed. And this is an area that's very productive. So really quickly, why is the bigleaf magnolia so important and so interesting? Well, first off, it has the largest simple leaves and simple flowers of any tree species in North America. And that's a really cool statistic. You can see some of the volunteers that I had here, just how large these leaves are. And it really is like you're in the jungle. And it's just such a special plant. Also, Andre Michaud, when he did his travels back in the late 18th century, he actually took his voucher specimen from Gaston County, and that exists in the herbarium of the Botanical Garden in Paris. So it's interesting that he found this really fascinating plant that long ago, and now you'll find this bigleaf magnolia in stately gardens all across the globe. So moving a bit more specifically into Redlair now, looking at this elevation gradient, the bigleaf magnolia has a rather specific habitat niche, I would say. It's only found in very specific places. And if you look at this interesting map of Redlair here, you'll see that there are many, many deeply cut ravines with small ephemeral streams that flow into the Catawba River. And I'll show you in just a moment where the bigleaf magnolia is distributed, but they're almost always on these north-facing slopes that are very proximate to these small, sharply cut ravines. So why might that be? Right? That's one of these driving questions that we'll get to in just a moment. Also thinking about soils. This is a bit of a busy figure here, but what I'd like to show you here is there's the Tatum series here in the Northwest, and this is derived from the Kings Mountain Belt. It's a bit more sterile, a bit rockier, generally more dry. And then we have the more fertile Pacolet series here in the center. And again, that is what's going to be found for our main plot for this real ecology study. And this is that study site. So this is the Old Lakes Creek watershed. And what I draw your attention to are these 3 plots in this transect. So I was interested in effects due to an elevation gradient. And instead of measuring this entire area, which is really quite long, and it would be rather inefficient, I'm taking slices of the landscape that are 100 square meters, 5 meters in this direction, and then 20 meters across. So sort of looking at what does it look like at the top of the hill? What does it look like in the middle of the hill? And what does it look like at the bottom? So using these topographic positions as sort of the basis of the study, we can begin to take some detailed information. So this is what a typical scene would look like. Here I am with 2 people measuring the stems. We have this plot laid out here with the meter tapes, and we're going through and measuring the coordinates of each and every one of these bigleaf magnolia stems. It's quite important because it'll be able to track it over time. And that height measure is a really good proxy for understanding what stage of development these bigleaf magnolia are in. So we can see here measuring the heights of the bigleaf magnolia. And when we're dealing with the associate woody species, or for larger bigleaf magnolia, we'll measure their diameter at breast height. That's a better measure of their contribution to the ecology of the plot. So I was really interested in edaphic factors and trying to figure out how all of this, worked. So there was some interesting soil sampling data that came about. And I found that all of the highest performing plots had circumneutral pHs, between 5.6 all the way up to about 6.2 in the highest case. And they all had very high base saturations, lots of manganese, lots of calcium, lots of magnesium, and a bit of phosphorus. So these are really rich plots, and there seemed to be a correlation between those two. Of course, the bigleaf magnolia is found across a vast majority of community types at Redlair, and these names are using the convention in Michael Shapley's fourth approximation. But really what I want to show you here is that the bigleaf magnolia is found all across the landscape. So getting into these driving questions for this specific study, I wanted to understand, this idea of community assembly. And in community assembly, one of these ideas was of the environmental filter. What sorts of factors exist that might allow for a certain species to thrive in a given niche? Also, do the edaphic factors play a role in the distribution, right? So I mentioned that there might be some of these sweeter, more rich soils existing on parts of Redlair. Does that play a role? Also, I was interested in seeing how the bigleaf magnolia coexists and competes with other woody species in some of these very high competition zones. So with that in mind, I took a quick list here to show you what the different co-occurring woody species were. And I'll tell you that the red maple was far and away the most common species, with a close second being the American beech. These two were found in vast numbers with mostly small stems. And then the additional plants here, the sourwood, the flowering dogwood, and the red mulberry occurred in smaller numbers, but they behaved like those small mesic species. The ones that were outliers, though, were the white oak and the tulip poplar. These were sometimes 43 centimeters in diameter and contributed quite greatly to these plots in terms of shading out the bigleaf magnolia. So again, to get into this question of the elevation gradient, this is sort of the hypothetical, right? So if you have leaves that are the largest of any North American tree, wind is going to be your enemy, right? So if we are in an area with an upper slope that's unprotected from the wind, I would hypothesize there would be far fewer bigleaf magnolia occurring there. And conversely, as we go further down the slope and are becoming more sheltered, it's reasonable to assume that the abundance of stems at the lower slope might be higher than that of the upper slope. So this is kind of getting into that question of community assembly of shelter from the wind might be a very important environmental factor. And sure enough, it revealed that. So at the upper slope, there was not a single bigleaf magnolia to be found. And there were quite a few xeric species, like quite a few white oaks and quite a few red oaks as well. But as we got further down the slope, we saw that these distributions continue to increase for the bigleaf magnolia. So in the mid slope here, we had a total of 27 juvenile plants, and they're mostly below this 90 centimeter mark. Whereas in the lower slope, there were a total of 48. So there was a jump in the number of juvenile bigleaf magnolia here. There are a few that were 120 centimeters. And there were also a couple of larger seed producing bigleaf magnolia that were outside of the plot. So I did not measure those, but it stands to reason that with larger, more mature species being sheltered from the wind, growing proximate to this lower area on the slope, there would be more regeneration there, and the bigleaf magnolia would expand from that point on. Of course, this was a wonderful project with quite a few volunteers, and I really enjoyed that aspect of the project of getting out to work with these people and sort of share some of these ecological principles with them. Okay, thank you very much.